Good morning, you're watching AnewZ. I'm Dilek Tuna. You're watching our special coverage of the 7th meeting of the European political community. Leaders from across Europe gathered in Denmark's capital to discuss some of the most pressing issues of our time, from strengthening Ukraine and addressing hybrid threats to tackling economic security and migration. And joining me now is our AnewZ Deputy Editor-in-Chief, Orkan Amashov. Welcome to the program.
Thank you today. Very good morning.
It's always a pleasure sharing the AnewZ screen with you. Now, over the next hour, we'll see heads of state and government stepping onto the red carpet here at the summit venue in Copenhagen. After arrivals, leaders will move into the opening plenary. Roundtables will follow, focusing on hybrid threats, economic security and migration. The European Council President Antonio Costa will co-chair today's summit alongside Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, and will be bringing you live arrivals, reactions from leaders and analysis on what this gathering could mean for Europe's security and unity. Now, we had news just before we came on live that Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen was making an address, and we can clearly see from the live coverage there that that is obviously over. This looks like the
President of Serbia just arrived.
Just arrived, did he? Okay,
yeah.
So arrivals are starting shortly, and we'll continue to bring you some of those names as we progress through the broadcast. Now, Orkan, firstly, let's discuss for our viewers what the European Political Community Summit is all about and what we can expect from these couple of days.
Yeah, as I said earlier, the President of Serbia just arrived, and he will be received by the Prime Minister of Denmark. A European Political Community, as an idea emerged just a few months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine during summer, and it is widely regarded by many people, and I suppose rightly so, as a brainchild of French President Emmanuel Macron at a time when Europe needed to formulate a consolidated vision and approach to the Russian actions in Ukraine. And the first summit took place in Prague, and ultimately that was a very memorable summit for this region. And as I understand, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan just arrived. Yes, indeed. He just arrived, and also will be received by a Danish Prime Minister. Let me tell you more about that first summit. And since Prime Minister arrived as well, it will be apt time to tell you what happened there. Azerbaijan and Armenia, for the first time in Prague on the 6th of October 2022, agreed on the mutual recognition of territorial integrity and sovereignty. That was a crucial moment, and that changed the nature of the peace process.
Orkan, can I just cut you
President
off?
Aliyev, President Aliyev arrived.
Yes, President Aliyev has just arrived at the venue as well.
Yeah, President Aliyev, and that's Armenian Prime Minister.
And also joining us on the program, let's bring in our guest, Richard Giragosyan. He's the Director of Regional Studies Center in Yerevan, Armenia. Mr. Giragosyan, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're very excitable at the moment, so we're sorry for asking you to wait a little bit. And then just as I was about to announce you, President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, arrived at the venue. So you can understand that we're all a little bit excited today by the hype that's going on in Copenhagen. Thanks for joining us on the program. And also joining us is my colleague, Orkan Amashov. So the three of us will hold the discussion today.
Thank you for joining, Richard. It's great to have this opportunity. But Richard, you know, Azerbaijan and Armenia, I suppose, do no longer need European platform to meet and agree on something very consequential. What happened on the 8th of August in Washington was indeed very important. But still, in terms of EPC, bearing in mind the memory, the 6th of October 2022, when President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan agreed on the mutual recognition of territorial integrity and sovereignty, what is your expectation from this summit when it comes to Azerbaijan and Armenia?
Well, that's a good question, Orkan. And I would have two specific points. First, this particular EPC summit in Denmark is an important, significant opportunity for the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan to further their diplomatic discussions. But I also agree with you on a second point. This particular summit is also very different from previous EPC summits, meaning that Armenia and Azerbaijan are now in a very different period of post-war diplomatic engagement. We don't need European facilitation as much as we once did. And I would also point to the breakthrough summit in Abu Dhabi several months ago, where the Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders achieved much progress prior to the August White House ceremony. But overall, this EPC summit is an opportunity for both leaders to further the talks.
And beyond Azerbaijan and Armenia, beyond this region, what is your expectation from EPC? They quite often say that this is not an institutionalized mechanism. It doesn't have secretariat. It's effectively EU countries plus other continental countries. How would you evaluate the significance of the summit, and what is your fundamental expectation in general in terms of the results that may emanate from today's discussions?
Well, I would see the weakness of a lack of institutional apparatus or mechanism as an advantage in terms of giving the European leaders more flexibility in formulating policy responses. The other important aspect is the timing of this EPC summit. It comes after yet another Russian escalation of attacks against Ukraine and the incursions into NATO member airspace, especially the use of drone attacks over Poland. In this context, the EPC is again facing this lingering threat from Russia. For Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, there is now much more of a shared recognition of Russia as a threat.
That's very interesting, and particularly in the context of that idea of actually at the expense of frozen Russian assets to provide 140 billion loan for Ukraine. Do you expect, because there are many legal and political constraints on the way to achieving that particular consensus, how do you envision discussions in that particular context, in the context of actually raising 140 billion loan for Ukraine?
That's a good question, Orkan. And I think the real obstacle here is Washington, not Brussels. In other words, this is very much an EPC summit. It's not a Western community summit. And I do think the Trump administration's lack of reliability, lack of clarity is one of the main obstacles. Nevertheless, I think both President Trump and President Putin have done a lot to unify the European Union. And in this context, we do see a greater recognition of the burden of responsibility. Security for Europe is much less about relying on the Americans and much more about self-sufficiency on the continent.
Mr. Gregosyan, you did just underline that this was a EPC summit, not a Western Europe summit. But how do security commitments in Western Europe translate or fail to translate to places like Ukraine, the Caucasus or the Balkans? Are we reinforcing a Eurocentric bubble?
Well, yes and no, to be quite honest. On the one hand, the European Union's, let's say, adaptation is a very belated move to the security threats. Without the American commitment and foundation, it is still questionable. Nevertheless, I do think the Caucasus and even Central Asia have now garnered much greater strategic significance. One thing we didn't talk about is also the importance of Turkey. From an Armenian perspective, we see also progress in normalizing relations between Armenia and Turkey. And I do think the perspective in the Caucasus is more Turkish involvement means less Russia.
It's very interesting. Just noticed that Ursula von der Leyen arrived as well. So dignitaries are arriving still up to, I think, probably 12 o'clock Baku time, Yerevan time. The guests will be arriving. Richard, one more question about connectivity. EPC is about a wide range of issues, including security, Russian threat, and also connectivity. So Trump route for international peace and prosperity has been discussed in Azerbaijan, Armenia. It looks like that there were some meetings during September. American officials were present in Yerevan and so forth. I would like to specifically ask about the following. Principal consensus has been attained. Armenian sovereignty will be respected. Azerbaijan will be able to get this unhindered passage access to Nakhchivan exclave. But critics talk about the lack of concrete agreements. They say that principal agreement is there, but concrete agreements have not been attained yet. In the context of connectivity, do you feel that President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan may achieve certain new kind of agreements today or in the wake of today's meeting?
I think it's quite possible to see further progress in this regard. If we look at connectivity, the breakthrough agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan remains unfulfilled. We still have challenges over financing, construction, and third, the operational details. Nevertheless, the significance of the breakthrough agreement was undeniable. And I do think it's based on compromise and concession by all sides. I also think the future of connectivity depends much more on Baku and Yerevan and much less on Washington. But I do see this validation of connectivity, meaning that economic interdependence now returns a serious degree of deterrence, where we're further from war and closer to peace.
That's indeed very interesting. And also, very recently, I think the Speaker of the Armenian Parliament, Alen Simonian, said that a peace treaty itself could potentially be signed even during early 2026 or before mid-2026. Bearing in mind the referendum in Armenia will not take place until summer, at least. It will take place after the elections. What does that statement signify, you think?
Well, I think it is significant. The Speaker of the Armenian Parliament is actually a little bit premature, however. One key precondition that remains from the Azerbaijani side is Armenia's amending of its constitution. Yet the process is underway. The Armenian government is committed to this. It's more of a question of timing. The second part of the Armenian parliamentary speaker's statement was more relevant and interesting. He went on to say that Armenian-Azerbaijani bilateral trade is also expected to increase and begin, marking this new period of connectivity. And whether it's even Azerbaijani gas supplies to Armenia or general cross-border transit and transport, I do think we've passed a milestone in the relationship between Baku and Yerevan.
Yes,
okay, thank you, Mr. Girogosyan. And Anthony Costa has just arrived as well at the summit. So we're just keeping an eye out on the guests that are arriving as we listen to your answers, Mr. Girogosyan. My next question is, at this summit, leaders are discussing a drone wall to protect European airspace. What would a viable European drone wall look like in practice? I mean, technically, politically, and legally. Who pays, who leads, and who operates?
Well, obviously, I share the same questions and I don't have the answers. However, from a military perspective, this is a unique opportunity for a joint or collective commitment to air defense. And I do think the European Union is moving slowly but steadfastly into burden sharing of defense and security. But I also think the threat of drone warfare, whether from the war of 2020 here or Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine, demonstrates the revolution in military affairs. This is very much the war of the future we're defending against.
Richard, one more question. Next summit, I think 8th summit, will take place in Yerevan, Armenia. Both President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan are present today. The question is whether President Aliyev will be present in Yerevan as well. As I understand, on the basis of the rules related to protocol, only heads of state and government are participating, not foreign ministers. So what is your feeling about the way towards that summit? Do you expect Azerbaijani representative there? If not president, probably prime minister.
I'm not sure. It may be too soon. It also depends on sensitivity with an Armenian election set for this coming June. It also depends on the status of the constitutional change. However, I remain optimistic because it is now clear the Armenian government is moving swiftly to invite the Turkish president, Erdogan, to Yerevan in a very highest level summit. In that context, the Azerbaijan leadership may also feel much more comfortable coming to Yerevan, accompanied by the Turkish president. So I do see we're moving in the right direction and moving faster than many expected.
Indeed, and also naturally, yes, we are moving in the right direction, as you said, and that summit, which will be taking place during May 2026, just before the parliamentary elections in Armenia, it looks like a very, very, very pivotal juncture. Do you believe, Richard, in retrospect, that when the decision was made to grant Armenia this privilege of hosting 8 EPC, this political moment was also taken into account? Or do you think it's quite outside the realm of the possibility?
I don't see this as a coordinated and well-organized rotation. I think it's more a coincidence. Nevertheless, it's now an opportunity to demonstrate statesmanship and to reward political will as a positive momentum of this return to diplomacy.
Okay, Mr. Gorgosyan, some critics say Europe has chronically underinvested in defence and that the US pivot might leave a security vacuum. Is this summit a wake-up call for Europe to take primary responsibility for its own defences? And if yes, what can Europe realistically deliver without US support?
I would say no, it's not a wake-up call. That alarm clock has already gone off. This is more a snooze button. And the European Union is adjusting to the painful reality of questions over American commitment. But I do think the NATO alliance, as well as the EU in security terms, has actually been motivated, revitalized by the clear and present threat from Russia. And I really think the real loser here is, of course, Russia. The real winner, however, is China in the strategic picture.
That's incredibly, incredibly interesting. And also many analysts, Richard, are talking about very strange sort of amalgamation of US and Chinese interests in the context of Trump route for international peace and prosperity. Naturally, that particular route is element of the wider middle corridor. And we know that there is a tension between the United States of America and China regarding the middle corridor, because US looks like firmly believes that Central Asia should be connected with Europe via South Caucasus, via Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's no doubt about that. But the US does fundamentally believe that China should not benefit from that access. So effectively, the United States does believe that China shouldn't benefit from the middle corridor, which many, many analysts believe is counterintuitive. And in the example of Trump route for international peace and prosperity, we see these two interests sort of both clashing in a sense and also coming to terms, because there is an element of American control with respect to Armenian jurisdiction. There's also a benefit for China. How do you evaluate this both clash of two interests and also the picture wherein they kind of coming to terms in a way?
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical about the strength of the U.S. position. For the Trump administration, this is yet another real estate deal. It's about Trump's ego as much as it was about Armenia and Azerbaijan. But I do see China, both in terms of Central Asia and the South Caucasus, looking more to China as a offset, a counterbalance to Russia, rather than the U.S. per se. And I do think now that the Belt Road Initiative has passed in terms of a Chinese priority, we do expect Chinese interest, especially in the construction of some of this middle corridor. And I'm not sure the U.S. has the capability to resist such a Chinese involvement. I would also argue that for Armenia and Azerbaijan, the more players involved to counter Russia, the better. And for the Americans, bypassing Russia and Iran may be enough.
Very interesting. We just noticed that British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is arriving, and he's recently been described as the most unpopular British Prime Minister on record, and the circumstances enveloping the situation there in London is incredibly complicated with the rise of reform and so forth. Recently, Richard, here in Azerbaijan a couple of days ago, the first Azerbaijan-UK policy forum took place, and I was present there. And one of the key questions there was that 8th of August changed the reality, and UK will have more kind of consolidated view. And now I think that Prime Minister Starmer...
Well, yeah, let's just interrupt and...
Yeah, let's have a listen to what the Prime Minister Starmer is saying.
All the further options we can take together, obviously, I've always argued that working with other countries is always a stronger response. So we're looking at a number of options there.
I mean, I commend the peace process between Azerbaijan and
what more we can do. So we'll be
Armenia. I had
there is
the
also
pleasure
then
and honor to have the Prime Minister of Armenia recently for 2 days in Strasbourg. You know, exactly in this context.
Migration
and yesterday
and
and also
two
1 week
dominant
ago,
issues
conversations with the President of Azerbaijan.
Prime Minister,
I mean, we
can I just
are
ask,
with
have you had
our
any
two member
reaction to the
states,
BBC's
Azerbaijan and
investigation into
Armenia,
mechanism
working
I've not
for
yet
this
seen the
stability
footage,
and
but
for
I've had it
also
described
perspective
to me.
for the whole
And it's
region,
shocking.
South.
We just heard from British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. Richard, just back to my original inquiry. Analysts there were saying that now that 8th of August breakthrough took place, UK will have a more sort of all-encompassing view regarding South Caucasus, with strategic partnership with Azerbaijan and Armenia changing the whole landscape. Two questions really. How do you envision UK presence in the South Caucasus regarding Azerbaijan and Armenia? And number two, to what extent this policy of UK is still somewhat coordinated with the United States as part of that special relationship?
Well, on the one hand, I do see a promising future for UK engagement in the South Caucasus. First of all, it's because British Petroleum and UK energy-driven interests have predominated its policy in the region and Azerbaijan. However, given this new stage of connectivity, we do see an opportunity for the Brits to play a more positive role in supporting regional connectivity and economic interdependence. On the other hand, it's less about the transatlantic relationship and more about Britain finding its footing after its rather disastrous exiting from the European Union. But at the same time, for Azerbaijan, we just saw the Italian president come to Baku and finalize a very significant deal with the Azerbaijani Diplomatic Academy. It's not just the British, it's also different EU member states who are actively contributing to the regional stability.
That's incredibly interesting because, yes, indeed, Italy is Azerbaijan's biggest trading partner within the European Union. And if memory serves me correctly, Dilek, you may correct me if I'm wrong, I think 95% of Italy's trade in the South Caucasus is actually related to Azerbaijan. Those two countries, of course, UK and Italy, have very strong relations with Azerbaijan. But analysts are saying the UK will slightly change its position, will be more sort of this policy will take into account interests of all the countries, all the constituent members of the South Caucasus. Dilek, do you have any particular question?
I do actually. I want to bring in another angle now, Richard, if I may. We've been talking about Europe's external security, and it pretty much seems to me that that's what the theme is surrounding during this summit: defending skies, protecting borders, supporting Ukraine. But what about security inside Europe? For many migrants and ethnic minorities, security means freedom from racism, protection from protests, and the right to live without fear. So how much space is there at this summit for that dimension of Europe's security?
That's a very good question. Also, because we see another aspect of security beyond the hard security focus, and that is the cyber attacks on major airports and other Western institutions linked both to Russia and China in the past. We also see attacks on undersea cables in the Baltic Sea. But in terms of what you're referring to, the challenge of migration, I really think the major impediment is unfortunately the policies of Hungary and other more far-right elements, which actually make the problem much worse in dealing with the policy challenges. Ironically, for the South Caucasus, we're moving in the right direction, unlike Hungary or some other far-right elements in the European political spectrum.
And leaders are discussing Europe's ability to stand on its own 2 feet militarily. But isn't Europe's long-term strength also about cohesion at home? So I'm still on the same topic here, whether societies can withstand divisions, racism and anti-migrant unrest. Without that, doesn't strategic autonomy ring hollow? And I know you mentioned Hungary, but we see a lot of the unrest in France. Just even in London recently, you know, the huge protests, and we don't want migrants in our country anymore, you know, along those lines.
Well, yes, you put your finger on a very embarrassing problem for the Europeans, especially if we see the AfD in Germany, for example, as well as the far right in France. This is a distressing, disturbing trend. Unfortunately, that seems to be encouraged by the Trump administration's policies within the United States, especially on immigration. And I do think there can be no genuine hope of security cohesion within the EU without addressing, if not solving, these internal weaknesses and vulnerabilities.
Richard, also amongst the issues that will be discussed today as part of roundtables and bilateral, probably Palestinian is the question of the unilateral recognition of conjectural Palestinian state. Do you think in the aftermath of the UN General Assembly, where the world at large was fully in favor of recognition, with the United States and Israel adopting a completely different position, Europe has sort of lost its moral ground when it comes to this intricate subject?
Well, what we saw, for example, demonstrated by the UN address by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, where over 50 representatives walked out of the room in protest. As we saw in the earlier report on your channel about the flotilla, what we see is America and Israel clearly in danger of being on the wrong side of history. For the European Union, it is a very delicate challenge and one that they're not really passing very well. But I do think the humanitarian aspect means the situation in Gaza, the vulnerability of the Palestinians, demonstrates the high human cost of every passing day, which makes the lack of political will that much inexcusable.
Indeed. And also, specifically, I would like to ask about Turkey and Turkish-Armenian normalization at this juncture. There have been a couple of meetings. One of the things which should have happened is they're actually opening borders in the context of Turkish-Armenian border for third-party nationals and for the holders of diplomatic passports. Do you think we will see the implementation of that agreement very soon?
Well, that is the current Turkish offer in a recent meeting between the Turkish and Armenian special envoys. I've long been in support of normalization. However, I disagree with this current policy alternative simply because it's a half measure. It's insufficient in the current reality. The border has reopened twice and has been allowed to close again. We don't need to reopen the border partially for third country nationals. We need to proceed with the full border reopening. Nevertheless, there is progress. Turkish Airlines is now committed to coming to Armenia. We are expanding our direct links with Turkey. But I do think, given the context between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's a new environment, a climate change, much more positive to fulfilling normalization in reopening the border and establishing diplomatic relations.
Indeed, the atmospherics of Azerbaijani-Armenian dynamics have changed massively as of 8th of August this year. And when it comes to that full opening of Turkish-Armenian border, do you think that will happen the day after Azerbaijan and Armenia actually signed that deal, which has been already initialed? Is that the event that should take place in this dimension, for that dimension to take further step?
Well, yes. In other words, what we see is it's become a question of when and not if. We also see the Turkish side requiring political cover and Azerbaijani assistance in fulfilling the terms of normalization. But I do think equally important is the establishment of diplomatic relations, not between Armenia and Turkey alone, but also between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is not a time for timidity.
Yeah, and diplomatic relations could only be established once the peace treaty is signed and the instruments of ratification are exchanged, and then of course diplomatic relations will start. And also, Richard, more specifically, my colleague and friend Murat Muradov, the co-founder of the Topçubaşov Center, and I just noticed that Georgian Prime Minister just arrived in Copenhagen. And of course, we may discuss issues related to wider Caucasian domain. Just to follow my previous inquiry about Murat Muradov, I think he recently was in Yerevan. He was attending a very interesting event. How would you evaluate the importance of human-to-human contact? When President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan meeting somewhere, it's very, very commendable, it's very important, but actually ordinary Azerbaijanis and Armenians, not just policy analysts, but ordinary people actually talking to each other. To what extent do you think we will see much of that in the upcoming month?
Well, that's a very good point. In fact, I was with Murad. We were both speakers at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He was widely and warmly welcomed. We also need much more of this people-to-people contact. First, we can leverage this synergy of progress between Armenian and Turkish civil society, but also in terms of the necessity for a bottom-up investment to ensure a lasting, durable peace. The day after the peace treaty is signed will be equally important. And it's also about ending years of demonization in the region. I also think civil society, as well as activists on both sides, increasingly have more in common, given Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine and the looming, lingering threat of Russian aggression in this region.
It's quite extraordinary that actually Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed dynamics in this region. That changed effects on the ground here because Azerbaijan started to act in a more assertive way after February 2022 here in Karabakh within Azerbaijan. And of course, that fundamental, crucial agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Prague was attained during the first EPC summit. And this EPC summit, 7th summit, naturally, fundamentally about confronting Russian danger. When you look back at those 2 years, or actually 3 years already, how do you think Azerbaijan and Armenia collectively kind of navigated this very intricate issue? Because these two countries need to be very careful with Russia, but simultaneously they need to maintain their independence. And it looks like they're both interested in gradual decrease of Russian influence in this region, in the South Caucasus. How do you see them in early October 2025 with regard to that particular challenge?
Well, I see both Armenia and Azerbaijan realizing that there's a window of opportunity. Russia remains distracted and overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine, but that window of opportunity is closing. And we do see a storm on the horizon for both Baku and Yerevan. An angry, vengeful Russia lashing out at all of her neighbors in the near abroad. The danger for Armenia and Azerbaijan is not going too far too fast. In other words, this has to be an incremental reassertion of independence of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And we should expect Russian defiance or opposition to these efforts. And this is why resilience is key. In Armenia, this makes the strategic advantage of democratic institutions much more important. But I do think Azerbaijan has done a good job at openly defying Russian interests in the region.
That's very interesting.
Okay, now just going back to the EPC agenda, one of the main talking points there is strengthening Ukraine. Now, EU leaders are floating the idea of using frozen Russian assets to loan or fund Ukraine. Is using frozen Russian funds to support Ukraine legally and ethically sound?
Well, legally, I don't know the answer. I would say ethically and politically, it's a smart move in one key regard. Beyond the imposition of sanctions on Russia, this is a much more practical penalty, a liability that Russia has to pay for not only its failed invasion, but its continued aggression against civilians in Ukraine, kidnapping of Ukrainian children. In other words, the list of violations is very long. And I do think asset seizure is very much a necessary penalty to impose on Russia at this stage.
And also, Richard, if I may, I don't know to what extent you know about the clout exercise by Danish Prime Minister, but there has been some suggestion that she could eventually emerge as one of the key European politicians, someone reaching the importance and scale of Ursula von der Leyen. And this particular summit, the 7th summit of EPC, is going to be a testing case for her. What do you make of her personality? She has quite often been described as a lady of gravitas, acumen, certain degree of charisma, and there is a school of thought that when you select future European leader, you try to choose somebody from a country which is not really predominant European country, not from France and Germany, perhaps in this particular case, but somebody from a relatively small European country. And this would give Europe that sense of, that would enable her, that particular person, to be a proper leader. What do you make of Madam Fredriksen's makings of a new kind of pan-European leader?
Well, I support this opportunity. First of all, the Danish Prime Minister in many ways reminds us of the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who also accomplished a great deal during the COVID crisis. But secondly, the emergence of Denmark as a European unifier and leader is underestimated. This is less of a time of traditional, rather tired politics of statesmen from France and Germany, and much more about harnessing the dynamic energy coming from the Nordic-Baltic region. This is why there is a fresh opportunity. It's also why Germany and France, unfortunately, are losing ground in terms of initiative and energy.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Richard Guiragossian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining our special broadcast today. We appreciate your participation and insight.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. I didn't want to turn this into another Caucasus now, but of course, naturally, discussing all of those regional dynamics, particularly related to Azerbaijan and Armenia, is incredibly important. And when we looked at this subject, 7th EPC summit, both from a pan-European perspective in the context of the subject related to Ukraine, but also from the regional perspective. And I'm so grateful to you for your very, very perceptive and enlightening answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the EPC is ongoing and world leaders are continuing to, European leaders rather, are continuing to arrive at the scene, and roundtable talks will take place throughout the day amongst many other occurrences taking place there. We will bring you updates and information throughout the day as we continue to receive the developments from on the ground, as the AnewZ team is there to continue to update us with the latest developments. So do stay tuned to AnewZ, and we'll continue to bring you more.